Quonset hut.
Quonset hut.
Quorn.
Quorn.
Quorum.
Quorum.
We need a quorum of 7.
Quota.
Quota.
The government has imposed quotas on the export of timber.
The government has decided to scrap quotas on car imports.
Several countries have now set quotas for cod fishing. There are plans to introduce strict immigration quotas.
Each person was given a quota of tickets to sell.
In the 1990s, the Navy couldn't fill its quota for new recruits.
Workers only get paid if they make their quota.
They're worried that they won't achieve this year's sales quota.
The committee has had more than its quota of problems.
I think I've had my quota of coffee for the day.
Quotable.
Quotable.
A speech full of witty, quotable phrases.
Quotation.
Quotation.
A quotation from the Bible. The following quotation is taken from a 19th century travel diary. A dictionary of quotations.
Ask the builder to give you a written quotation for the job.
A quotation for car insurance.
Get a couple of quotations from different companies before you decide which one to use.
Quotation mark.
Quotation mark.
Quote.
Quote.
She quoted from a newspaper article.
He quoted a short passage from the Bible.
A military spokesman was quoted as saying that the border area is now safe.
Can I quote you on that?
You can order by phoning our hotline and quoting your credit card number.
He quoted a figure of 220 deaths each year from accidents in the home.
Mr. Jackson quoted the case of an elderly man who had been evicted from his home.
The nurses' union was quoted as an example of a responsible trade union.
He quoted the example of France as a country with a good rail service.
The nurses' union was quoted as an example of a responsible trade union.
They quoted a price of £15,000.
The firm originally quoted £6,000 for the whole job.
The pound was quoted this morning at just under $1.46.
The company is now quoted on the stock exchange. The minister said, quote, "There will be no more tax increases this year."
A quote from the minister's speech.
Always get a quote before proceeding with repair work.
Quoth.
Quoth.
Quotidian.
Quotidian.
Quotient.
Quotient.
Is all this healthy food supposed to increase my happiness quotient? Is all this healthy food supposed to increase my happiness quotient?
Quran.
Quran. QV. QV.
Qwerty.
QWERTY.
R.
R.
Steve Gunderson.
Elizabeth R.
Rabbi.
Rabbi.
Rabbinate.
Rabbinate.
Rabbinical.
Rabbinical.
Rabbit.
Rabbit.
He kept rabbiting on about the environment.
Rabbit punch.
Rabbit punch.
Rabbit warren.
Rabbit warren.
Rabble.
Rabble.
A rabble of angry youths.
Rabble-rousing.
Rabble-rousing.
He accused union leaders of rabble-rousing.
A rabble-rousing speech.
Rabid.
Rabid.
A group of rabid right-wing fanatics. Rabies.
Rabies. Raccoon.
Raccoon.
A raccoon coat.
Race. Race.
He will be the youngest runner in the race. Over 80 cars will take part in the race.
The annual boat race between Oxford and Cambridge universities.
The school welcomes children of all races.
A person of mixed race.
The law forbids discrimination on the grounds of race or religion.
The 1960s produced a new race of young novelists.
A school's breeding a race of children incapable of making decisions for themselves.
More and more drug companies are joining the race to beat cancer.
The race is on to develop more environmentally friendly forms of energy.
It is now a race to find the killer. The pilot then began a desperate race against time to land the plane before it ran out of fuel. The pilot then began a desperate race against time to land the plane before it ran out of fuel.
Mr. Byrd has now officially joined the race for the White House. He is no longer in the race for academic awards. The race to host the next Olympic Games.
We spent a day at the races.
She'll be racing against some of the world's top athletes.
Stevens will not be racing in the final due to a knee injury.
I'll race you to the end of the road.
You will be racing a Ferrari in this year's Formula One championships.
He raced into the village on his bike.
I had to race home for my bag.
She was raced to hospital. He raced to meet her.
Investors are racing to buy shares in the new high-tech companies.
The astronauts are racing against time to repair the spaceship.
My heart was racing and my knees shook uncontrollably.
My mind was racing, trying to think where I had seen him before.
My heart was racing and my knees shook uncontrollably.
My mind was racing, trying to think where I had seen him before.
Race car.
Race car.
Race card. Race card.
Race course.
Race course.
Race goer.
Race goer.
Race horse.
Race horse.
Race meeting. Race meeting. Racer.
Racer.
Race relations.
Race relations.
We need to do more to promote good race relations.
Community leaders are working to improve race relations in the city.
Race riot.
Race riot.
Race track.
Race track.
Racial.
Racial.
A victim of racial discrimination.
This part of the community needs to be protected from racial prejudice.
Evidence of racial harassment.
The campaign for racial equality.
The need for tolerance and racial harmony.
A broad range of racial and ethnic groups.
People of different racial origin.
They live in a racially mixed area.
Police officers believe the attack was racially motivated.
Racialism.
Racialism.
Racing.
Racing.
Watching the racing on television. Today's racing results. Racing pigeons.
A racing yacht.
Racing car.
Racing car.
Racism.
Racism.
The government has promised to continue the fight against racism. The government has promised to continue the fight against racism.
The problem of racism in schools.
Racist.
Racist.
He denied being a racist.
The victim of a racist attack.
Racist violence.
Racist remarks. Rack.
Rack.
A wine rack.
A magazine rack. Thousands of people were tortured on the rack.
The company is now well and truly on the rack.
The house had been left to go to rack and ruin. A lot of designer clothes are now available off the rack.
Great sobs racked her body.
Her face was racked with pain. Lisa was racked by guilt.
I racked my brains, trying to remember his name.
He racked up 41 points.
Racket.
Racket.
The old machine used to make an awful racket.
Police believe he is involved in an international smuggling racket.
A tennis racket.
Racketeer.
Racketeer.
Racketeering.
Racketeering.
People involved in smuggling and racketeering.
He has been arrested on racketeering charges.
Raconteur.
Raconteur.
Raccoon.
Raccoon. Racket. Racket.
Racquetball.
Racquetball.
Racy.
Racy.
A racy novel.
Rad.
Rad.
Have you guys seen Wendy's new place? It's so rad.
Radar.
Radar.
The coastline can now be monitored by radar.
We could see the plane quite clearly on the radar screen.
This is one of the issues on our radar. How did this band slip under the radar?
Radar gun.
Radar gun.
Radar trap.
Radar trap.
Raddled.
Rattled.
Her raddled face.
Radial.
Radial.
Radial roads leading out of the city centre.
Radial tire.
Radial tire.
Radiance.
Radiance.
A young face full of radiance. The moon's radiance.
Radiant.
Radiant.
She looked radiant in a white silk dress. A radiant smile.
They were both radiant with happiness.
A lovely day with clear blue skies and radiant sun.
She looked radiantly beautiful.
Radiate.
Radiate.
He radiated calm confidence.
Kindness radiated from her.
The log fire radiated a warm, cosy glow. Heat radiated from the glowing coals.
There were tiny lines radiating from the corners of her eyes.
Radiation.
Radiation.
An accident at the power station could result in large amounts of radiation being released.
A lethal dose of radiation.
Sun creams work by blocking harmful ultraviolet radiation.
Radiation sickness.
Radiation sickness.
Radiator.
Radiator.
Radical.
Radical.
They are proposing radical changes to the way the company is run.
A radical reform of the tax system. There are radical differences between the two organisations.
He has put forward some very radical ideas.
I was shocked by her radical views.
A radical approach to education.
A radical left-wing politician.
A radical feminist.
That was one radical party last night.
Radical.
Radicals on the extreme left wing of the party.
Radicalize.
Radicalize.
Radically.
Radically.
The situation is radically different from that of 10 years ago.
A radically new approach to the problem.
Mozart radically altered the structure of the opera.
Radicchio.
Radicchio.
Radii.
Radii.
Radio.
Radio.
I sat down and turned on the radio.
I don't really listen to the radio very much.
Did you hear the interview with the Prime Minister on the radio this morning?
He's got his own radio show now.
She works for a local radio station.
We received a call for help over the ship's radio.
We should be able to reach them by radio.
We've lost radio contact with the plane.
The ship radioed for help.
We radioed London for permission to land.
Radio. Radio.
Radio paging.
Radioactive.
Radioactive.
The problem of how to dispose of radioactive waste.
A consignment of highly radioactive plutonium.
Radioactive dating.
Radioactive dating.
Radioactive waste.
Radioactive waste.
Radioactivity.
Radioactivity.
The discovery of radioactivity.
High levels of radioactivity.
Radio beacon.
Radio beacon.
Radiocarbon dating.
Radiocarbon dating.
Radio-controlled.
Radio-controlled.
A radio-controlled toy car.
Radiogram.
Radiogram.
Radiography.
Radiography.
Radiographer.
Radiographer.
Radiology.
Radiology.
Radiologist.
Radiologist.
Radiotelephone.
Radiotelephone.
Radio telescope.
Radio telescope.
Radiotherapy.
Radiotherapy.
Radio wave.
Radio wave.
Radish.
Radish.
Radium.
Radium.
Radius.
Radius.
The shock of the explosion was felt over a radius of 40 miles.
There are more than a dozen golf courses within a 15-mile radius of St Andrews.
Radon.
Radon.
Radwaste.
Radwaste.
RAF.
RAF.
Raffia.
Raffia.
Raffish.
Raffish.
An interesting character with a raffish air.
Raffle.
Raffle.
A woman selling raffle tickets.
Raffle.
Raft.
Raft.
The company has launched a whole raft of new software products.
Rafter.
Rafter.
The club was packed to the rafters.
Rafting.
Rafting.
Whitewater rafting.
Rag.
Rag.
He wiped his boots dry with an old rag.
An oily rag. He writes for the local rag.
Children in rags begged money from the tourists.
He likes to tell people of his rise from rags to riches. Rag Week.
Rag.
Raga.
Raga.
Ragamuffin.
Ragamuffin.
Rag and bone man.
Rag and bone man.
Ragbag.
Ragbag.
A rag bag of leftover bits of food.
Rag doll.
Ragdoll.
Rage.
Rage.
Sobbing with rage, Carol was taken to the hospital.
Sam became quite frightening when he was in a rage.
Just then she heard Mr. Evans's bellow of rage.
His face was red with rage.
Forrester stared at his car, trembling with rage.
Animal rights supporters were incandescent with rage.
Richens was 17 when he flew into a rage and stabbed another teenager.
DiCaprio became all the rage after starring in the film Titanic.
The rage for cycling has been growing.
He was sorry he had raged at her earlier.
How was I to know Jenny raged?
Civil war has been raging in the country for years.
A debate is raging about what form pensions should take.
Outside, a storm was raging.
The battle raged on.
The fire raged for 12 hours and 15 people died.
A great cholera epidemic raged across Europe in 1831. We couldn't wait to go out and rage.
He was attacked in a road rage incident.
Ragger.
Ragga.
Ragged.
Ragged.
Ragged blankets on the bed.
A raggedy hat.
Crowds of ragged children played among the rocks.
The old photograph looked a little ragged at the edges.
A ragged hole.
Raggedy hair. The crowd gave a ragged cheer. Ragged breathing.
He looked ragged, so I told him to go to bed.
He ran United's defence ragged. Raggedly dressed.
She was breathing raggedly.
Raging.
Raging.
A raging appetite.
I was in a raging temper. A raging debate.
Raging inflation.
The show was a raging success.
Richard developed a raging headache and had to lie down.
A raging fever.
A raging storm.
A raging sea.
The fire had become a raging blaze.
Raglan.
Raglan.
Ragu.
Ragu.
Rags to riches.
Rags to riches.
Ragtag.
Ragtag.
A ragtag fighting force.
Ragtime.
Ragtime.
Rag trade.
Rag trade.
Ragweed.
Ragweed.
Ragwort.
Ragwort.
Rye. Rye.
Raid.
Raid.
A bombing raid.
An air raid warning siren.
The colonel led a successful raid against a rebel base.
The army launched several cross-border raids last night.
A police raid.
An FBI raid.
4 people were arrested during a raid on a house in London.
A dawn raid.
A bank raid. An armed raid on a shop in Glasgow.
Police found weapons when they raided his home.
Air bases on the mainland from which the island could be raided.
The gang raided 3 homes in the area. Peter went into the kitchen to raid the fridge.
Raider.
Raider.
An armed raider.
Masked raiders carried out a bank robbery today.
Rail. Rail.
The American rail system.
A high-speed rail network.
Passengers want a better rail service.
The Channel Tunnel and its rail links with London.
We continued our journey by rail. I need to buy a rail ticket.
Cheap rail fares.
Several passengers were leaning against the ship's rail.
A towel rail.
A curtain rail.
At 17, he suddenly went off the rails and started stealing. The coach was credited with putting the team back on the rails.
The police railed off the area where the accident happened.
Consumers rail against the way companies fix prices.
Railhead.
Railhead.
Railing.
Railing.
A small park surrounded by railings.
Raidery.
Raillery.
Affectionate raillery.
Railroad.
Railroad.
The supplies were sent on the railroad.
A railroad station.
The workers were railroaded into signing the agreement.
Railroad crossing.
Railroad crossing.
Rail trail.
Rail trail.
Railway. Railway.
A railway company.
Railwayman.
Railwayman.
Railway line.
Railway line.
An old disused railway line.
Railway station.
Railway station.
I'll meet you outside the main railway station.
Raiment.
Raiment. Rain. Rain.
A night of wind and rain.
There will be heavy rain in most parts of the country.
I left my bicycle out in the rain.
Last year, the rains came on time in April. The archers sent a rain of arrows towards the enemy. Don't worry, we'll be there, rain or shine.
Outside it was still raining.
It's starting to rain.
It must have rained quite hard last night.
She attacked the man, raining blows on his head and shoulders.
Bombs rained down on the city.
The match was rained off.
Rain boots.
Rain boots.
Rainbow.
Rainbow.
Rain check.
Rain check.
Care for a drink? I'll take a rain check, thanks.
Raincoat.
Raincoat.
Raindrop.
Raindrop.
Rainfall.
Rainfall.
We've had a long period of low rainfall.
The city has received only half its average rainfall of 4 inches. Rainforest.
Rainforest.
The destruction of the rainforest.
Rain gauge.
Rain gauge.
Rainproof.
Rainproof.
A rainproof jacket.
Rainstorm.
Rainstorm.
Rainwater.
Rainwater.
Rainy.
Rainy.
A cold, rainy day in October.
I hate rainy weather. The rainy season.
Raise.
Raise.
Can you raise the lamp so I can see?
William raised his hat and smiled at her. Raise your hand if you know the right answer.
Many shops have raised their prices.
The university is working to raise the number of students from state schools. A campaign to raise awareness of meningitis.
Dr. Hayward intends to raise the museum's profile.
The trust hopes to raise $1 million to buy land.
They are raising funds to help needy youngsters. A concert to raise money for charity.
Changing the law cannot raise standards.
The team need to raise their game.
He did not raise the subject again.
I'd like to raise the issue of publicity.
Betty raised the important question of who will be in charge.
This attack raises fears of increased violence against foreigners. The way the research was carried out raises doubts about the results.
Albert raised his eyes and stared at Ruth. "No," he said without raising his head.
Adele raised herself from the pillows. He raised himself up on one elbow to watch.
Stan's dad died, leaving his mother to raise 3 sons alone. It was time for Dean to settle down and raise a family. Anne married a Jew despite being raised a Catholic. The new generation was the first to be raised on processed food. Camus was born and raised in Algeria.
He raised cattle in Nebraska when he was young.
Jim retired to raise raspberries.
The rebels quickly raised an army.
I couldn't raise a smile.
Blanche raised her eyebrows in surprise.
The band's new sound will raise some eyebrows.
He's never raised his voice to me.
I could hear raised voices in the next room.
Ladies and gentlemen, will you raise your glasses to the bride and groom?
Sam stayed with his injured friend, while a passing motorist raised the alarm.
The violence has raised the spectre of civil war.
Another problem then raised its ugly head.
He has raised the bar for other filmmakers.
I'll raise you $100.
I'll raise hell with whoever is responsible for this mess.
The kids next door were raising hell last night.
They finally managed to raise him at Miller's sheep farm.
Try as he might, he could not raise her.
Jesus raised Lazarus from the grave.
2 raised to the power of 3 is 8.